Something extraordinary is unfolding between two nations that have shared the longest peaceful border on Earth for more than a century. The United States and Canada, two democracies bound by trade, culture, and a deeply interwoven way of life, are now locked in a confrontation so sharp, so charged with historical consequence, that senior officials in Ottawa are using language not heard in living memory. And at the center of it all is a single recurring phrase being fired from the most powerful office on the planet, a phrase that treats a sovereign nation not as a neighbor, but as unfinished business. What Donald Trump is doing to Canada right now is not just political theater. It is a calculated, deliberate, and escalating pressure campaign directed at the identity of an entire country. And tonight, we are going to walk through every layer of it because once you understand the full picture, you will not look at this relationship the same way again. The story begins with what appeared to be a moment of relief. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney, fresh from a high profile appearance at the NATO summit, told the world something millions of Canadians desperately wanted to hear. He said that Donald Trump had moved past the idea of absorbing Canada, that the annexation talk had quieted, and that the two leaders had reached some form of mutual understanding. People exhaled. Markets steadied. The commentary class declared the worst of the storm had passed. That moment of relief is now completely gone. Trump has returned to calling Mark Carney the future governor of Canada, and he is not doing it once in a careless aside. He is doing it repeatedly, methodically, and with full knowledge of how deeply that framing cuts inside the Canadian political establishment. This is not a new phrase for Trump. He used identical language against Justin Trudeau during his first term, and back then, most observers treated it as bluster, as performance. But something has shifted fundamentally in this second term. The language now arrives wrapped in concrete policy architecture. In March of this year, the annexation framing was deployed during a critical window of tariff negotiations, appearing precisely when Washington wanted maximum psychological leverage over Ottawa. In May, the same rhetoric was attached directly to the Golden Dome Missile Defense Initiative, with the implication that Canadian benefit was somehow conditional on a reordering of the relationship itself. And now it has returned again, aimed with precision at Carney standing inside his own country at the very moment Canada's internal political landscape is more fragile than it has been in a generation. A former United States ambassador to Canada has stated publicly and on the record that Trump understands exactly what this rhetoric does to Canada and that he reaches for it deliberately because it functions as a pressure instrument. Sit with that. A senior American diplomat, someone who built their career strengthening the bond between these two countries, is now telling the public that the current president is intentionally using language about territorial absorption as a psychological weapon against an allied democracy. That statement alone tells you how far outside normal boundaries this moment sits. The consequences inside Canada have been tectonic. Canadian nationalism has transformed into something louder and more visceral than the world has ever associated with that country. In April of this year, Carney's Liberal Party won a majority government that would have seemed improbable 12 months earlier. 5 opposition members crossed the floor to stand with the Liberals. The Conservative Party, within striking distance of power not long ago, has been reduced in public opinion to a secondary force. Carney's campaign built itself around a phrase pulled straight from hockey culture, elbows up, and that phrase has become something Canada has rarely produced in modern political life, a genuine national rallying cry crossing regional and partisan lines. You hear it in Atlantic fishing towns, prairie farming communities, and Pacific coastal cities. Polling indicates Carney now commands stronger approval even in Alberta, the one province historically most resistant to Liberal leadership. And yet beneath this surge of national feeling, beneath the unity and the slogans and the striking solidarity, a very dangerous pressure point is building fast. The Alberta independence referendum is approaching. And what happens there will determine whether Canada enters the next chapter of its history intact or fundamentally altered. Stay with me, because what comes next reveals the full strategic architecture of what Washington appears to be executing and why the stakes of this confrontation reach far beyond anything a trade dispute has ever produced between these two nations. To understand what is actually happening here, you have to step back from the daily noise and look at the pattern, because the pattern is where the truth lives. Donald Trump has not been deploying the annexation narrative randomly. He has been reaching for it at specific moments and for specific reasons. Each time it surfaces, it is attached to a pressure point in the bilateral relationship. Each time it lands, it forces the Canadian government to spend political energy simply reasserting the basic reality of its own existence as a sovereign state. That is not an accident. That is a strategy. When you force your counterpart to defend something so fundamental that it should never require defending, you consume their attention, their resources, and their public communication bandwidth. Every press conference where Carney must address whether Canada is for sale is a press conference where he is not talking about housing affordability or healthcare infrastructure or the economic anxieties of working Canadian families. The diplomatic chessboard has been tilted, and Ottawa knows it. What makes the Alberta dimension so particularly combustible is that it transforms this from a simple bilateral standoff into something with a genuine internal fault line. Alberta has carried a complicated relationship with Ottawa for decades, rooted in energy revenues, resource jurisdiction, and a persistent feeling that central Canada neither understands nor respects the Western experience. Those grievances are real and long-standing, but under normal circumstances, they are managed within the ordinary machinery of Canadian federalism. These are not ordinary circumstances. Reports have surfaced indicating that officials connected to the United States Treasury held conversations with figures inside Alberta's independence movement. Whether those conversations were casual or something more deliberate, the signal they send to Ottawa is unmistakable. It communicates that the internal cohesion of the Canadian Federation is not something Washington considers off limits. It says that a fracture line inside Canada is potentially a lever. For Carney's government, navigating this requires extraordinary political balance. He must project unity at home while managing an adversarial posture from the South. He must speak with firmness to Washington without triggering economic consequences that ordinary Canadians would absorb directly and painfully. The economic interdependence between the two countries is staggering. More than $2.5 billion in goods and services crosses that border every single day. Energy, automotive parts, agricultural products, financial flows, all woven together across decades of integration that cannot be untangled quickly or without serious damage. So the resistance Carney is building must be calibrated with a precision that leaves almost no room for error. On the economic front, his government has been accelerating trade relationships with European and Indo-Pacific partners. On the diplomatic front, Ottawa has been working through G7 and NATO structures to ensure the international community understands what is happening and that sovereign borders between allied democracies are not treated as negotiable. Domestically, the elbows up movement has grown beyond anything a political strategist could have manufactured. It has become organic and cultural, a shared shorthand for collective refusal to be diminished. The global dimensions extend well beyond North America. Middle powers in Europe, East Asia, and Latin America are watching what the United States does to Canada and drawing their own conclusions. If the most integrated trading relationship on the planet can be subjected to territorial rhetoric and separatist engagement, then the concept of reliable American partnership requires serious re-examination everywhere. The coming months will be decisive. The Alberta referendum will test whether Canadian unity holds under simultaneous external pressure and internal strain. The trade negotiations will reveal whether there is a functional floor beneath this relationship. And the choices both leaders make will signal to the watching world whether the rules governing allied relationships since the post-war era still hold. The border between these two countries has been peaceful for over 200 years. That peace was never automatic. It was built through generations of diplomatic labor and a shared understanding that sovereignty is not a position in a negotiation, but the precondition for everything else. When that understanding is placed in question, the consequences move through every dimension of the relationship. Mark Carney has chosen to stand firm. Whether that posture holds and whether it reshapes this relationship in ways that outlast the current moment in Washington, that is the story that will define North America for years to come.